what I'd like you to do is imagine, in consciousness studies, especially the materials, this is kind of an interesting thing. Let's say, imagine what it's like to be a bat, or imagine what it's like to be a zombie, Searle and all those people invented. So what I'd like you to do is, but I'm not coming from a materialist standpoint, imagine what it's like to be improvised. Okay, I'm going to play, and what I'd like you to do is kind of maybe close your eyes or just, it doesn't matter so much, but feel the music as if it might be coming through you. You might be the one who created it. And there'll be some spaces here, and try to go into the spaces between the notes. And with the sense of what might happen next. So I'll play a little phrase. And we do this anyway, whether we're trained to this or not. In fact, my musical training may actually annihilate the sense a little bit. As listeners, we sense, we have this question of what might happen next. It's called implication realization. So now what we're doing is actually putting our attention on this thing that we all do. We're going to sense, okay, what might happen next. And so a very key aspect of musical engagement is the relationship between your expectation of what might happen, the possibilities, and actually what does it. Now, if the disparity between your field of expectation of probabilities and what actually happens is radically different, then there's a kind of disconnect. On the other hand, if what you expect is so much in line with what happens, then the impetus for actually engaging in music is kind of limited. Okay, so what great improvising does is kind of straddles that delicate line between sustaining a coherent chain of thought, but introducing enough rhyme so that you can kind of, it's coherent enough for you to kind of realize, okay, my language is being spoken to some degree, but it's not so predictable that you feel like, what am I doing? I'm being told a story that I've been told many times. So let me see if I can do that. So just kind of feel this music coming through you as if you're one playing it, and just a very gentle, delicate sense of what might come next. So the interesting thing for me after that, after giving that commentary before that, is I'm thinking, I wonder how they're going to deal with this. It's not a very good thing to do. It's going to be funny. I wonder if they're going to like this, or I wonder if we thought this was coming out. So, one of the great things about going later in the day is you can link all kinds of threads that have come up in earlier talks. I like doing that. And I don't know how many people know Rick Tarnas's book. It's a great book that came out probably 7 or 8 years ago, maybe by now, called Cosmos and Psyche. And Rick is in the cosmology, transformative studies, philosophy, something like that at SCS, a major course. So he wrote a book called Cosmos and Psyche. It's basically about, it's a theme that's come up a number of times today. Do I need a microphone? So Rick's book is about the inextricable link between the human consciousness and the cosmic psyche. There's a great, long, massive, incredibly, let's talk about an incredibly chopsy book. I mean, Rick has incredible chops, and he tells the story as well as just about anybody. And towards the end, he says something, and I got to bring this out for my students. He said, nothing seems as inner as Psyche, and nothing seems more outer than cosmos. So the idea that actually totality, and it's almost like the idea that the things being inner and outer go out the window. Very, very powerful account of that. So Rick is not here, but you probably appreciate the fact that I'm putting improvisation in front of his title. Let me email him actually. I'm not sure about this. Because one of the things that I'm arguing is that improvisation is actually it's an essential aspect of the cosmic structure. To use the word structure is a little bit problematic. And jazz is a kind of a lens. And so what I mean by a second tier problem, hard problem of consciousness, most people are probably in consciousness, probably are familiar with what's called the hard problem. And basically the hard problem is the question, how does consciousness emerge from a neurobiological or physical substrate? And of course, I don't want to be too presumptuous here, but it seems to be growing consensus that it doesn't. Consciousness is primary in the broader scheme of things. And so what I call a second tier hard problem of consciousness is this. It has to do with the intersubjectivity that's inherent in the improvisation process. So intersubjectivity means collective consciousness. Improvisers talk about when we are playing, and as listeners and as human beings, you have this experience all the time also in terms of the connections with other people, but it's very, in the arts, it's quite in improvised music, where we feel a oneness with each other. All of us, when we're playing, we feel as if we're trying to kind of get a little of this happening, where basically we are communicating in very profound word ways across sensory domains. So the question is, how does intersubjective consciousness emerge from individual consciousness? And the answer I'm coming up with is the same. It doesn't. Intersubjectivity is primordial in the cosmic scheme to individuality. So it's kind of an ambitious idea, not incoherent with a lot of what has been talked about today. So Leslie, I think I said this last year in California, Leslie gets the award for the best title. I thought the book was great too. Leslie wrote a book called Consciousness Explained Better. And of course, the reason that title was so great, aside from that the book is a really excellent book, is that it was kind of a response to Dan Dennett's kind of the ultimate materialist treatise, Consciousness Explained. So it took a little bit of gall, but more cleverness for someone to come and write a book called Consciousness Explained Better. Okay, so I got dibs on this one. Consciousness explained best. So it started as a PowerPoint slide. And so the question is, what can jazz be a lens into this? That's very, we're all on probably most of us are on the SCS email list. We have interesting exchanges from time to time. But there's many of us are on another email list, and most of us don't know how we got on it. How many people are on this? Is it the Sadhu Sangha list? It's intense.
It's on my spam list at this point.
You get 10 emails a day.
It's really tiring.
And half of them are peer-reviewed length and footnotes and everything like that. It's amazing, and I don't even know if you can keep up with it. But the question is, it actually just came up recently, is, of course, what is consciousness is kind of the guiding thing. But this is the silly question. Whose domain is consciousness? Who owns it? Is it a thing for psychologists, or philosophers, or theologians, or even linguists, or anthropologists, or physicists, of course? Yeah, we all do. And the thing is, people in consciousness studies circles are really interested in the arts and have actually very sophisticated understanding of the arts. And as artists who also does scholarship, I love speaking about the arts, and particularly music, in circles in the humanities and sciences. But what's interesting in terms of what you might call an ontological lens into the nature of consciousness, the arts do not factor very highly. And one thing I would say I would say the same thing about musical studies circles. There's great commentary on the arts, a lot of it. But here's one thing I would say even about Ken. I'm a huge Ken Miller fan with some areas of departure, you might say. But one thing I would observe about Ken is that his commentary on arts is very powerful. I would say it tends to be object mediated. It's based on, as opposed to process mediated, it's based on the artwork as kind of the locus of meaning, transformation, of experience, and all that kind of stuff. That's part of the picture. That's part of the picture. There's very little, my book is actually one of the first that goes into it, in terms of going into the art process, creativity from an artistic standpoint, and particularly within creativity, within the arts, music, and particularly within the music, improvised music, and particularly within improvised music, this kind of music that has come up in American culture, African American culture, another story that needs to be told, contains not only, I would say, unmatched process materials, process stuff, processes, but also very powerful ontological criteria to at least contribute to the question of what is consciousness. So that's kind of what I'm going to go into here. So that I explained a second ago, because you have the conventional hard problem and the second, what I'm calling the second tier hard problem. So I want to go into what jazz has to offer, actually both hard problems. I was, somebody at lunch actually asked this question. I thought it was a really brilliant one. James Van Peth, actually, I think he's here right now, but Simon was there. He said, could a materialist account of consciousness explain improvisation? Improvisation. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, I think. In my senses, especially when you think about improvisation, not just from the standpoint of the activity itself, but if you think of it as something that the improviser, so the conscious human being, does and then reflects upon, actively, and then reflects upon and evaluates and assesses and kind of feels in a retrospective way, and then prepares for the next improvisation. Because you can look at virtually any life form, any species, and find some kind of improvisatory behavior. When it comes to going deep into the improvisation process, as we did a little bit at the very beginning, starting to look at it from the standpoint of going into its deeper dimensions, and then preparing for another improvisation, and recognizing that wow, there are tools to be developed. Okay, improvisation is inherent in the cosmos, so like on some degree, there's improvising is happening all the time. But one of the things that's emerging in, you might say, musicology, and in some decade this will happen, in some century, is that this whole improvisatory thing is really deep. There is an art of improvisation. There's a skill set. You have to practice. It may almost seem like a contradiction in terms. How can you practice improvising? Wouldn't the very notion of practicing improvising detract from the act itself? From a naive standpoint, yeah, there might be some of that. But when you actually start looking at it, you can actually realize that, ooh, not only can you practice, you better get in there. Because you have to have massive chops in your field. On the other hand, you need massive abilities to live from those chops. This is an enormous paradox. I call it the artist paradox, although it applies to every field. Okay, two things. Inherent in one seems like the annihilation of the other. Okay, the one in sports is a dramatic example too. I love the baseball. You know, is another thing. That was an improvisatory act, but it was somebody with enormous skills. And it's beautiful. Okay, so on one hand, we have to engage in just to master our craft, repetitive, highly repetitive practice. This is not improvising. Day to day, year after year, to develop skills at a really high level. Would that not annihilate improvising? Okay, left unchecked, yes. Okay, but in terms of the art of it, developing improvising skills, then there are a number of things that we have to do. And part of it is adopting an improvisatory intention. Part of it is engaging in music, things with our instrument that are explicitly oriented towards this liberating kind of sensibility. And then, of course, this is something that I don't think it's an accident that the jazz tradition is not only a tradition of extraordinary improvisers, it's also a tradition, people know the first, but they're not so aware of the fact that the jazz tradition is a tradition of contemplatives. I don't think it's an accident, for instance, John Coltrane or Alice Coltrane. Alice, she founded the Vedanta Center in Southern California. I don't think it's an accident that they were deep into contemplative disciplines. And because the way, in my model, improvisation kind of takes us from what I call parse the whole perspective, from the realm of intense activity into this inner integrated wholeness. And we, having gained that, you see the same. There's a great book again with sports is Michael Murphy and Rhea White. It's like 30 years ago. Transcendent experience in sport. You have the same thing, where athletes are invoking these, in many cases, very powerful transcendent experiences. And there's just a natural inclination to actually look at what you might call more systematic methodologies to integrate that. So meditation practices of various kinds. So I call it the interplay between parts of the whole and whole of parts. So that's one of the things that, wow, I'm kind of like not even paying attention to my slides and kind of where I am. I actually met Alice Coltrane just before she died a few years ago. Amazingly powerful individual. I designed at Michigan in fact, this happened, we had just met when this happened. It had just been in place, very controversial. It's one of the first, it says a degree program with meditation practices and related studies. And Dick Mann, like the months of Dick, so if you know, you guys, psychology is teaching some of the coursework. And it's based on the same idea. It was very controversial. Some of the arguments that came up were pretty entertaining. So one person said, in fact, there was I put the proposal forth, and it passed on the curriculum committee. We have a very big school of music, and then it has to go from the curriculum committee to the full faculty. It's like we have 120 full-time faculty in music along at Michigan, and so it sailed through the curriculum committee. and then comes on to the full faculty. It was a room a little bit bigger than this. It was like a really high-charged meeting, debates. For 6 weeks, there were emails flying. I had tendinitis from replying to all these kind of things. So I saved a few of the choice observations, and so one colleague said, "Oh, come on, you could do the same thing as meditation with Prozac." And then this person happened to be a classical pianist. He said, "What are we going to do? We're going to offer a degree in Prozac, or piano and Prozac." That was quite a moment. And then somebody else who focuses on music 300 years ago said this one. This is going to send the school back to the 1960s. He said. I'm thinking, but you're like 300 years. I'm still trying to figure that one out. So Clark, just to give you a little bit more of my background, this links a little bit back to Damon's talk a couple hours ago too, especially the issue that came up at the end, in terms of the orientation of the academy and music schools are really ironic. You think that of any area in higher education, I'm talking about mainstreams, wouldn't you think that that music would be an area that would be a hotbed of consciousness studies, open to all this stuff, improvisation and all this kind of stuff? It's actually the opposite. It's also intensely ethnocentric too. This would be a whole other symposium. And that's putting it generously. So anyway, I wrote a book called Music Theory Through Improvisation. It's a very radical kind of thing. In fact, Nate was here this afternoon. He's actually using it in his high school class. He goes for college classes. So that's one battle, getting improvisation in the core curriculum. And that's important to that is going to be getting improvisation as core. It's like a cultural core to actually the identity of students and faculty. And then, of course, in my book that Bob kindly referred to, the theme of that book is that improvisation is actually the heart of the structure of the cosmos. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. I asked that first question a second ago. But going to the second point here, there's a very interesting thing. If you look at accounts of peak experiences, and this is a great thing to do. I'm looking around, I know Jeffrey has, I'm kind of reminded of your research, which is like, it's more than peak experiences, actually enduring conditions of non-symbolic, enduring non-symbolic consciousness or something like that. So it's like the sense of like the next step of this. But if you read the reports of composers and compare them to reports of improvisers, this is a whole realm of musicology that has not, like this is happening right now. We're at the edge of we're redefining musicology. So composers, and this will go, you'll find, like if you read in Mozart's letters and Brahms and Wagner and Beethoven, they talk about even more contemporary composers, some great, Hindemith, for instance, has some great stuff on this, not so contemporary, but that the reports of transcendent experience are entirely consistent with what you might call an object-mediated transcendent experience, meaning that it's powerful, okay? Where the peak experience is described in terms of the kind of a revelation of the whole composition at once. So, I mean, it's amazing how the commentaries are so similar too. A whole symphony, Mozart, it appeared in fully finished form, right before me. All the orchestration. And I proceeded to write it down. Now, more contemporary composers will say something in that line, something like, in fact, Hindemith has a great statement. Now, we'll talk about improvisers in a second. It's a very different thing. And they're both cool. We need to realize that these are different lenses into the same goal, you might say. Hindemith said, he distinguished good composers from great composers. He said great composers conceive of large, huge chunks of music in an instant. Good composers painstakingly work out things over a long period of time. And maybe it sounds easy, something like that. All right, now, in an object-mediated worldview, and again, even integral perspectives on the arts tend to still, the great thing about integral is this. It draws from virtually any, there's one thing about Wilbur that we have to hand it to him. The cat has his hands in a lot of disciplines. It's like, that's that. But the thing is, in some ways, and again, I'm a huge fan, he'll identify patterns like in key areas where, okay, this is conventional, this is post-conventional, instead of postmodern, whatever, but here's integral, maybe it hasn't happened, or we see pockets of it. He hasn't done that in music. Okay, he tends, he's got a fairly sophisticated take on music, but there's nothing, it's just not part of the literature yet. I said in my book, and I didn't hear anything, so I don't know. Should I take Wilbur's silence as a positive thing, or actually, probably yes. Yeah. So the composer's account of the peak experience is object-mediated. The improvisers, when you hear improvisers talk about peak experiences, okay, what are they talking about? They're not talking about the materials. They're not saying, oh man, when I got to F minor 9, the thing I played was an absolute motherfucker. They might say that after the gig or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm just, what they're going to talk about is, I was watching my body from a distance. I was so attuned to the people in the band. We were one. Our consciousness, it was an absolute oneness. I knew what Benito was going to play. It's about the interaction. It's about the process. It's a process-mediated account. Okay, which is better? It's all beautiful. But the problem is, and you can see where there's social justice. See, all this stuff is a very interesting time. The power of consciousness studies is that really, and another thing I love about the integral framework is that when you really become fluent with it, you realize that you're, like all of the issues, like if you talk about ecological issues, you talk about spiritual issues, you talk about social justice, and the different kinds of strands within them, you realize that, oh my gosh, social justice, we have a social justice issue here, because we live, that's connected to an aesthetic issue, connected to a spiritual issue, and many other things in this way. In 1987, the House of Representatives passed a bill, a proclamation, it's H.R. 57, that declared jazz as a national treasure. And basically the statement is that this is the seminal, quintessential cultural contribution from America to the world. And it's an impressive moment, because we don't know. Okay? It's like it says that American musical culture is an African American musical culture at its core. This is a very problematic statement in music schools. And so when we think about the fact that musicology, that means that the whole curriculum ranges. Musicology is kind of like this, it's not just theory, it's ultimately it's practice too, is object mediated. It's based on the composed European work. Jazz has some of that, right? So that means that from an epistemic lens, we have a social justice crisis in our epistemology and pedagogy, and theoretical models. You see what I'm saying? That's why this is important. This is really important. So that's a little bit of a detour. But hopefully the kinds of things that are being brought up here can be seen as relevant in that concept. So going back to then the second version of the heart problem. So it's this heightened intersubjectivity. It's just kind of like a feeling. Wow, I just and it's interesting. I talk to people that, oh yeah, it kind of felt like oneness, but it's not. I'm still a materialist, and kind of like it's nice. You can't really just go like that. But it's nice, but it feels like one. Or is it actually indicative of some kind of ontological reality? And of course, the second is what I know I'm coming from. So there's a number of, okay, so we have sort of anecdotal experience, okay, but when we situate that, it's not totally irrelevant, but when we situate it into a number of other contexts, including, by the way, there's a ton of studies on intersubjective consciousness that are very compelling, that seem to indicate that, from different standpoints. I'll talk about that in a second. But at the moment, I want to talk about this. This is really nothing new in consciousness studies. A couple of angles on music that date back millennia. Now, the typical, so in a number of, in probably most cultures in the world, there's some kind of notion of the connection between music and the cosmos. You even actually have this in Western music. To some degree, it's kind of resurfacing, but it's particularly vivid in Indian philosophy, where this idea of Nada Brahma, the world of sound, the whole universe, the whole cosmos is at its core sound, and what sound is a manifestation of consciousness. And so there's what I'm trying to bring to this is that there's both a structural, again, we're going back to the interplay, but object mediated and process mediated. So from a structural standpoint, which is how it's typically viewed, in Indian music, the rag is kind of a melodic structure that is based on intervallic relationships that are rooted in primordial frequencies that emerge on a cosmic scale. So that's the connection. It's putting it in a very kind of directed group way. So that's kind of a structural analysis of it. Okay, and that's sort of what has prevailed. When we look at another aspect of Indian thought, we know play. So what does play mean? So play is play of creation. It's the play of Brahma, or the play of God, or the play of Great Spirit, however you want to look at that. And basically, in the activity of self-awareness on the part of the cosmic intelligence. So that's a theme that's happened, at least the word cosmic intelligence, that phrase. It's a process-oriented account of the same thing. So, to me, music, this is another dimension that I think supports this idea of the link between music consciousness and the cosmos. And you hear this phrase, participatory spirituality, I like it quite a bit. You hear different versions of it. When I talk about Rick Tarnas' book, it really, in my view, his whole account of the relationship with the individual psyche and the cosmic psyche is quite vivid and powerful. It's a very robust backdrop for participatory spirituality. Another important person is Jorge Ferrer, also at the CIIS. His work, to me, it's not quite he's another amazing person. Doesn't quite go as vividly into it as Rick, but to me, this thinking about the improvisatory nature of the cosmos and the fact that human improvising is a vertical manifestation of cosmic improvising, to me, is profoundly in line with this word. Participatory spirituality. All right. Well, it's that. Okay. My perception of it is this. We are co-creators in cosmic evolution. So it's not a passive religion. You might compare it to a more conventional notion of spirituality. I realize there's many of those, where there is something called spirituality. There is, and let's just say if it's a spirituality that recognizes a cosmic intelligence of some sort, the relationship is, I'm generalizing here, is what you might call passive. Okay, we tune into that. There is, we kind of go into that flow. A friend of mine is always talking about just letting go into the Tao, all that kind of stuff. a participatory account would take the next step and say that we are co-creating the Tao, or co-creating the universe, co-creating with the cosmic intelligence. Tom's, this morning, there's someone like there. And James is also in a number of other talks. Yeah. And that's one last slide. So I just have a, so the question is, this might help a little bit.
And I think you can push it even farther when there's different ranges and how people understand that. But the furthest you can push it is that the Tao is nothing but the sum total of all the members participating in all those details. There is no external Tao. So the music is also 100% working with the question.
In the way I love that. And the way I think about it is that there, no matter, okay, let's just say, for the sake of discussion, we're all in. Okay, so we're co-creators. We're co-improvising the cosmos with the cosmic intelligence. So we're doing it no matter if we're aware of that or not. The cosmos is different right now than it was. Oh, now it's different. It's all. Okay, the thing is, being aware of it, then the question arises, can we enliven this co-participatory relationship? And this is where spiritual practices come in. Being on some kind of pathway, but I think when the issue of sort of overarching worldview comes in, and to me, there is a difference in terms of if we're sort of on some kind of pathway, however we think about it, from the standpoint of being co-evolutionary improvisers with the cosmic improvisation, as opposed to maybe a more passive kind of approach. I'm not trying to make a judgment about it, I'm just trying to maybe, in a sense, operationalize what the idea might be in terms of day-to-day living. And so just to close up with, in terms of other ramifications of this, I'm thinking that of a few things. One is that there, many of you have probably heard of, and again, these are preliminary studies, but TM has these large meditation projects that they've held through the years and have actually published the findings that see that indicate that there's some kind of collective field influence that's generated from thousands of people coming together and meditating 8 hours a day, decreasing crime and all that, and this kind of thing. You do see this in peer-reviewed literature. Again, I would say that, although even I'm coming from that tradition and actually been part of those experiments, I would say definitely we need more studies of this nature. But I think definitely need to look at it too. And I'm happy to actually see those things cited from time to time. I'm also thinking about, there's a great book called Mind Before Matter that one of the, in fact, Rick Thomas has an essay in this book. So the whole idea is that consciousness is primary in the cosmos. And I don't know how many people know Dean Radin. Dean is a psychologist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he's one of the leading people on studying the subject of consciousness and also psi phenomena, extended capacity of consciousness. And so his essay was it was very speculative in a way, but it was I thought it's not unreasonable. And he's surmising that there'll be a time when they'll be able to assemble teams of what he calls intention teams, who can actually influence the environment just through sheer intention. And this is based in the premise that if consciousness is primary, then the human being actually has capacities to be co-active, co-interactive with the physical world. And that's okay, so in terms of primary applications and something like that, that's something to think about. And generally speaking, so I would put that in the category of, say, in my book, at the end of my book, I'm talking about. So it's to be the first application of integral principles of music. And so I'm putting these in the category of like a post-integral worldview, post-integral spirituality and evolution of consciousness. But I'm gonna stop there, and if anybody has any comments or questions, I don't know where I am in the time scale.
As an educator, I just wrote the book on how this relates to education. Surely we're missing the boat on reading improvisation and music out of education. Can you speak a little bit how you made that connection?
Can you ask?
Sure. I'm an educator,
Yeah.
and surely we're missing the boat on improvisation and music and how that relates to
Yeah.
teaching kids to think out of the box.
Yeah.
So you speak to how you connected those in your book?
Yeah. Well, the connection is very direct. I mean, it's a beautiful question, and it's a huge one. And I wish I could say we're making more progress than we are. When you think about public education, the role of the arts and all that kind of thing, because when this kind of issue comes up, the argument sometimes turns for, okay, you're focusing on higher education, and what we really need to do is go out in the schools and make this thing happen in the schools. But the question is, who is perpetuating the paradigm in the schools? And it's individuals that are trained at the universities. So to me, that's where the thing has to really, now this is not to say that individual, say, music teachers or other teachers too, for sure, cannot do innovative things on their own, although I think it's getting more and more complicated with the kind of legislation we're seeing on the educational front. But I'm looking at this whole thing in terms of the paradigm. The places where music teachers are getting trained is really stuck. This is really the problem. And again, going back to the issue that David brought up, I think he might have overstated it, but still there's a lot of it there. I mean, the reality exists in terms of improvisation. And this hits on the question. The majority of kids getting music degrees get music degrees with little or no experience in improvising, which is like the dominant musical process on the planet, and it always has been. I have this thing in my book where it's kind of like somebody getting a degree to do heart surgery, and they have a fear of blood. I mean, because the thing is that music students, many classical musicians have a fear of improvising. So it's a very serious.
I was just going to confirm that because I was raised as a classical musician and played violin and piano for most of my young life until I was 18, and it was the one thing that we barely ever did. And when we were forced to do it, say like music camp in summer, everyone hated it, or we were just terrified because it was never a skill that was ever kind of encouraged to be built up. It was always about interpret what the classic ancient masters have given you, because that's the developmental.
You said kind of as an aside that there's a developing consensus about linear consciousness. I wish I knew what that was.
Well, I just meant this, that I think materialism, even though the staunch materialists are digging in as deeper and deeper, I think they see the walls collapsing. I absolutely believe that. And I think actually there's a lot of closet materialists, even in the sciences. I absolutely think that, in that I think it's an empire that's collapsing, and of course then there's different accounts of materialism. There's also obviously different accounts of materialism.
Michael Murphy says these old views are going down one funeral at a time.
I mean, the old saying is that the paradigm shifts with the death of the people that held the previous paradigm. And I'm thinking that perhaps that's what we're witnessing.
Yeah, but I don't want them all gone. Like some of them.
Yeah, right. Well, he's a new paradigm.
Are exposed to music.
Absolutely.
I think that we are leading to consciousness.
Absolutely.
Well, can we winding this up. This has been great, and you didn't take up a full hour, so we've actually captured half an hour back. So, thank you very much.